Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Effective Media Show. I'm your host, Henry, and today we're going to be looking at The Expanse Season 1. The reason I decided to choose The Expanse to cover for Episode 1 is mainly because, to me at least, it has all the hallmarks for great futuristic sci-fi drama. Being a drama, naturally, the show will focus on a few key characters and how they interact with and move through the world around them. Before we jump into the analysis proper, I do want to preface that this analysis is going to be focused exclusively on the Expanse TV series. Sorry to all the book purists, but I thought that engaging with the show would be a little bit more entertaining. On that note, I want to clarify that this is going to be a seasonal, blind review and analysis. While I did mention in episode 0 that I like to cover media in their entirety, it's not necessarily something I can always do or even want to do. I find pondering on your shows as they come out to be a little bit more fun, a little bit more engaging. Also, I think it just is more genuine to your own beliefs and reaction to things. It's really undeniable that you have a different perspective of things when you have the whole picture in mind. Okay, with all that out of the way, we can finally start the actual review and analysis. Like I alluded to earlier, The Expanse is a futuristic sci-fi drama. Unlike most dramas, though, I think The Expanse generates its drama from the environment the characters inhabit. The setting is about 300 years into the future, and the world is completely mired in political tension, espionage, an arms race that has to deal specifically with science. And when I say the world, I'm mainly referring to the setting. The actual story takes place over the entire solar system. The major governing bodies are going to be Earth, Mars, and the Belt. Earth being represented by the UN that we're all familiar with. Mars being governed by the Mars Congressional Republic. Not a whole lot of information in Season 1 about how they were founded, or what their governing practices are, what their values are, so on and so forth. And lastly, the Belt. So the Belt is kind of an interesting thing. I don't know if in the books by this point, by the end of Season 1, there would have been some kind of actual lore dump or some kind of like backstory associated with a minor character that could explain this, but by the end of Season 1, we don't really know a whole lot about the Belt. You can infer a ton just based off of the actual setting that one of the characters inhabits. What I'm left to believe is that it's some kind of client state corporation kind of entity that is mainly run by Earthlings, maybe even Martians, what the Belters would pejoratively call the Inners, because there's already major hints at this point of the story that there's some kind of political resentment or even just first order political animosity between the Outers, the Belters, and the Inners, the Martians and the Earthlings. The most obvious thing you could point to that is solid proof of this is some kind of pseudo revolutionary group called the OPA, the Outer Planet Alliance, but it's like rebellion stuff in Star Wars. It's not an official thing, I don't think, or maybe it's been recognized as like some outer political terrorist organization or something like that. It's really not clear. There's more we could talk about given the OPA. I really think it's one of the most interesting aspects of the political dynamic within the show. It highlights a ton of different political philosophy that I'd love to get into, but we'll get into it as it becomes more apparent in the review itself. Now that we've covered the actual political bodies that are involved within the story, what I would argue are the major driving factors. We could begin discussion on a pretty basic understanding of the political landscape of the show. In Season 1, I think we're dealing with an Earth that has a hegemonic authority on pretty much all aspects of life going on within the solar system. Right from the jump of the show, you can tell that Earth and the UN inhabits a very luxurious position, not necessarily as the Imperial core, but as a core tenet of humanity itself. It's hard to identify what kind of liberal democracy Earth, and by extension the UN, is trying to be. At the start of the show, they're not exactly exercising embargo or tariffs or any kind of extreme control on Mars or even the belt, it seems. It would be all too easy to draw the comparison between the United States and the Soviet Union, but I don't think that's the case. I think what we're seeing here is a clear breakdown of what some people would call pluralism as it pertains to liberal democracy. I know I just threw some crazy words at you, but bear with me. Just to break that down a little further. The sentiment that most people hold whenever they inhabit a society that adheres to liberalism will generally be a live and let live kind of a mentality. Without getting bogged down into the weeds, this is generally accepted to be what is referred to as pluralism. At its core, it's a recognition and reconciliation with the differences between any group of people that share the same space within a society. Essentially, it's the acknowledgement that whatever worldview someone holds is equally as valid to yours. This works fine and dandy within a society if you're talking about intra-society relations. The only time this can truly get messy is whenever you start dealing with inter-society relations. So what we would come to know today as the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, World Health Organization, things like that, where two separate states need to vie for power in what is created and known as a hybrid legal space. As I alluded to earlier, I don't think that it would be a fair estimation to call the situation that the UN and the MCR finds themselves in to be very similar to the situation that the US and the USSR found themselves in our real world. Whether out of necessity or out of sheer cooperation for the greater good, the UN and the MCR have proved that they can work together in a hybrid legal space. That much is for sure. And even the fact that the MCR exists at all is proof that the UN and Earth at large do adhere to pluralism, at least to a reasonable degree. So we're clearly not dealing with a clashing of ideologies in the way that the US and the USSR was. However, the core idea of political pluralism is the distribution of power within a society and a system. And to what end is power in a system usually applied to, I ask you? I would answer that it's justice. As I said earlier, we don't really know the circumstances or the conditions that Martians had to set out on, and as far as I gather, it seems that all the Belters are basically indentured servants, living at the behest of their corporate masters, being put on water rations, being put on set schedules you have effectively no say in. Sure, whenever you sign up to go out into the belt, you negotiate a contract and you follow all the legal proceedings. That just further emphasizes the point that without political power, you have no agency. Without proper agency, you can't seek justice. Which leads us to the next major point I want to highlight as far as the political dilemma goes. Justice, equality, freedom, these basic things that everyone holds as core values actually go by another name. They're called first-order political values. Usually they're informed by the society that they're in, which comes as no surprise, right? However, this is where things do get a little scary. As you have may inferred by now, if there's first-order political values, then there must be second-order political values. And you'd be correct to think so. Second-order political values essentially boil down to how you treat your fellow countrymen and how you interact with the system that you inhabit. So if you have no proper recourse against the system that is oppressing you, it follows that you'd be well suited for revolution. Scaling up from there, it's only natural that someone would become populist, or for the ambiguous general good of the people. All that to say that whenever people feel they're not getting a fair shake, they're going to create political instability. So just to wrap it all up in a nice bow, because Earth, or the UN, however you want to put it, stand to gain from being the hegemonic power, do not see any threat to their positioning within the political system, and feel no pressure from second-order ideology within the imperial core. Politically, you'd be primed for war. Now that the Expanse's political landscape has been thoroughly investigated, I'm very excited to begin talking about the three leading characters we follow throughout the setting. Let's begin by taking a look at Christian Avasarala. We learn through dialogue that she is the Deputy Undersecretary for the United Nations, so pretty high up on the totem pole, like third in command or something, I believe. One of the first things we see her do on screen is interrogate an OPA operative who got captured in the belt. The thing I really like about the interrogation scene is the immediate contrast it demonstrates between the guise that the UN tries to give off as a peacekeeping organization and the cruel reality of what the interrogatee is experiencing. It's established in the show later that if you're born out in the belt, as most people are, your body develops in a very abnormal way due to the lack of gravity. There are certain treatments and ways of getting around this or minimizing the effect of low gravity development, but for the most part, it's like a staple of true belters, viewed culturally as something to take pride over. But it is that same pride that Avasarala is using to her advantage in her interrogation. Belters affected by this underdevelopment cannot be in Earth gravity for more than 1 hour. Their bodies simply aren't adapted to the crushing weight of the world. So Avasarala utilizes this by removing the prisoner from being suspended in water, thereby increasing his felt weight enormously due to the removed buoyancy effect. So withstanding the entire weight of the world that he sought to overthrow, he is subjected to interrogation by Avasarala. That's pretty hardcore. It's evils like this in particular that I feel most liberal societies are able to turn a blind eye to. By labeling someone as alien or other because some legal loopholes of being born as part of a belter workforce or something, they're able to just justify doing this. And Christian Avasarala is just the gal for the job, I guess. Before we see Christian do this, we actually get a couple of scenes with her before she has her primary action of the first episode. We see her playing with a younger member of her family, presumably a niece or a nephew, and the property she's on is quite nice. I know it's the future, 300 years, and wealth only continues to increase and spread out amongst the society, but you could tell that she must have some kind of vested interest as maybe some new emerging elite class that maybe specifically serves the public and has some kind of proclivity to it. Who knows? The main reason I bring this up, and I want to stress that point specifically, is because 300 years is a very long time for any kind of change to happen, especially institutional kind of uh, by the people social reform where things kind of have a tendency to trend a certain way. It's just something interesting I'd like to highlight about her character, given how much responsibility you'd really have at that level of profession. Even assuming that society would have progressed towards it being like a professional aristocracy where you have what are effectively ruling families who are only able to produce heirs, so to speak, who can perform at that level given the material condition that they have and they're able to inherit. Moving on to our next main character, we'll be discussing. His name is Jim Holden. He was born in Montana on Earth, which is, cold detail. We discover throughout the series that he has kind of a tragic origin. He was a test tube baby created to become the heir for some piece of property or land. So already you could say he was born out of obligation. Whether out of guilt or out of some sense of duty, his mother tells him why he was born and that he should get as far away from this place as he could. This leads Holden to enlist in the United Nations Navy, where he serves for a period of time. His service was cut short, however, whenever he tried to assault a superior officer. After being court-martialed and tried for this, he ends up getting discharged and books a one-way trip to Ceres. Ceres is a dwarf planet in between Mars and Jupiter, if you don't know. The given reason he states for going to Ceres in particular is that it was the most remote place he could think of. It is here we find him in the beginning of the series. After a rough start at life, we see him in episode 1 with a girl he's really sweet on. So things are looking up for him, I guess. All until they get a distress call at least. We'll leave it at that for now. Next up, we have Joe Miller. Joe is a native-born Siren, so he was born on Ceres, the Belter station, and he works as a detective for some kind of private security pseudo-police force. First time we see Joe on screen, he's conducting an investigation in some kind of casual lounge bar. While questioning this person of interest, another patron chimes in about how Joe looks like the Inners or something. Apparently, trying to stabilize the underdevelopment that low gravity causes has become a bit of a cultural touchstone. The patron then goes on to ridicule and criticize Joe's ineffective treatment. In an attempt to emasculate and intimidate Joe, he points out that some of the vertebrae in his neck have fused. The patron then goes on to explain how this is the side effect of some ineffective treatment. I really enjoy this specific piece of writing. All in a matter of moments, we get the cultural attitude towards the police force, the cultural attitude towards normative treatment of the underdevelopment because of low gravity. We also get a full display of the kind of man Joe Miller is. After the patron fails to intimidate Joe, he says some quippy one-liner and basically takes him down in a matter of seconds. The characterization is great, the world building is great, and it leaves some pondering for the viewer as to, is Joe just a really badass kind of a guy, or did he have some kind of advantage by having denser bones? It's very well done. That's where we'll leave Joe for now. Okay, now that we introduced the characters and got to know them a little bit, let's move on to the story beats. To really give the character analysis some time to shine, we're going to be going through each episode and each character individually. So let's start episode 1, titled Dulcinea, with James Holden, aka Jim. Yes, his government is James. No, I will not call him that. This character is far too interesting and cool to be called James. Anyways, as we talked about before with Jim's character, he attempts to restart his life at Ceres after being ejected from the Navy. After arriving at Ceres, he decides to start working for an ice hauling company. He continues working there for 2 or 3 years, I think, and by this point he's developed a pretty good reputation. This leads us to his first appearance on the show. Following a failure to report for duty or something like that, the XO, the second in command on the Canterbury, the ship that Jim is on, is flagged or considered AWOL, or absent without leave. Quick sidebar. I'd just like to sing the praises of the show writers and the original authors for this. There's so many little details like this throughout the show. The structure that they use in the real world's merchant navy, the US's merchant navy at least, is essentially just the rank structure of the US's navy. So it tracks if in the real world you would just copy and paste something that works onto a new institution, that you would do it for something even as revolutionary and novel as space travel. Like, really think about it. If in our real world we started conducting regular flights even just to the moon to create like a moon base or something, withstanding that it's not the Space Force or some official branch of the government or military, some private organization would obviously pick up the slack. And that private organization, even if it is like a corporation or like a nonprofit or something, they're still going to need a pretty rigid power structure, a well-defined power structure at least, to basically ensure that there's always someone who knows what to do, or at the very least, there's someone who's always in charge. So to see it in the show and have it be portrayed so realistically and genuinely, I guess, it's really cool to see. Anyways, the XO being declared missing or AWOL or however they put it prompts Jim to go look for him. Why Jim specifically? I don't know. I can't remember. I watched season 1 like a month ago. The point is, Jim is going to go look for the XO. Upon entering the XO's quarters, Jim finds most everything in disarray. The XO has plants that he's ripped out of his pot, which are, I'm assuming, like pretty expensive if you're living in space generationally. All the lighting is fucked up. Just generally bad vibes. After stumbling through the quarters for a little bit, Jim happens upon the XO, and lo and behold, the guy's gone crazy. He's got a big-ass magnum that he's just waving around, and he's babbling nonsense, and to be fair, Jim is handling it really well. Like, he's demonstrating all the qualities and traits you would assume that someone who has served in the military would demonstrate. It's not so much that he's fearless or brave or courageous or anything. The main thing that jumped out to me whenever I watched the scene was that he was just stone cold calm. Honestly, it almost seemed like he was a little indifferent, but maybe that's just my take. Even with the XO waving the gun in his general direction, like gesticulating towards him with it in an unsafe manner, he's totally cool with it. It's not until the Exo starts to go a little bit more crazy and starts aiming the gun at a porthole that Jim starts to really show signs of concern. And looking back on this moment holistically, with the whole season in mind, kind of changes my perspective as to maybe why he was showing concern. I don't think it was in even his own regard of safety. I think he was really worried that the Exo was going to suck himself out into space. So the Exo ends up shooting the gun and shooting the porthole, but gotcha, bitch. It was actually a fake porthole because you thought a ice freighter would actually be able to afford a real porthole. Got him. And that's really the first glimpse we get into Jim's character. Now, of course, more happens for Jim throughout the episode, but I want to take you through the major beats, like the major character beats for him. Because the Exo is obviously no longer capable of performing his duties, the captain actually offers the job to Jim. Like I said before, he's really grown to be a trustworthy, respectable member of the crew. Jim gives the captain a nothing answer, basically to get out of it and to think about it. It isn't until later that he's hanging out with his girlfriend, Aide, that I mentioned earlier. And by hanging out, I mean doing it crazy style on the air. Which, another sidebar, right? Sex in Zero G is actually like crazy intimate. I know it's already like a very romantic, sensual, intimate thing to begin with on Earth, but when you have to hold on to your partner, or like you trust your partner to be the anchor point, like, I don't know, it hits different, you know? But anyways, when they're hanging out after the fact, and he brings this up to Aide, and she tells him to go for it, which he's taken aback by because he sees a future with her. The way I read this is that he's finally found a little bit of permanence in his weird, conditional, impermanent life that he's had up to this point, and it seems like it's a big betrayal of trust for him. Maybe he's not that trusting of a guy, maybe he's good on putting on an act, but yeah, it's just something to take note of that I found really interesting. Fast forward a bit, the Canterbury receives a distress call. The navigator or the comms person, the crew at large, discerns it's coming from the Scopuli. It's another one of these like tugboat freighter kind of ships, and it's still crazy far, right? Because it's space, but they could get there in like a day or something. The captain decides that it's too far, it's too out of the way. Everyone wants to go home. They've been on like a 2-week mission or something. They've been gone a while. They've been gone long enough that they don't want to deal with this shit. It's put to bed because Jim never really gave him a proper answer whenever the captain's trying to get the crew in line and say, hey guys, we're not doing this. Everyone's kind of like hesitant because, of course, human empathy is going to shine through. They're like, oh, well, what if it was me? Which you rightly do, you know, if you're a well-adjusted person, even if you've been born and raised in some dysfunctional work camp in space. But Jim takes the opportunity to step up and basically accept, like, on the fly, like, yeah, I'm the Exo, like, hey guys, he said we're not doing it, so we're not doing it. Interestingly, Aide, his girlfriend, takes offense to this, or she's disappointed in him, and this later causes him to respond to the distress signal when he's on watch that night. Everyone's pissed because of this. I mean, some people are pissed, and I get it, but, you know. So they travel the distance to get there, and upon visually inspecting the Scopuli, they could already tell some weird shenanigans are afoot. Upon making visual contact with the ship, they could see there's no real hull damage, but all the bulkheads are open, all the airlocks are open, and the crew note that this is like typical trap behavior. Like, if there were ever, this seems sketchy, you know? Which, another sidebar, super interesting. I love whenever you can infer things from the dialogue that happen in the setting of the world. Sure, whenever you trade or transport anything valuable, there's the chance that you're going to get robbed for it, but the fact that there's enough of a demand for things that crime is just going to become a part of the belt lifestyle, the fact that there is like pirate gangs, assumedly, pretty cool detail. But anyways, sidebar over. It's important to note at this point in the episode that the crew make a point that they don't need to go inside. Like, they went up, they visually inspected it, and according to the conditions and the circumstance that they found themselves in, Like, they could be done with it at that point. They don't need to board the ship. At least that's how I remember it. I'm going off of memory, I know. But that's not good enough for Jim because he's kind of on this path to redeem his character and like his quality to his girlfriend Aid. So, but then again, they're not even like fully committed to each other. It seems like their relationship. It does a good job of like establishing the ambiguity of both of their emotional availability in such a short time. But you know, dead set on going in. So Jim basically picks a crew out. He ends up boarding the ship, and things stay weird. Bit of a ghost ship situation. Nothing immediately wrong upon inspection with the ship. Even went through proper like reactor shutdown procedures. Everything seems to be completely normal aside from the fact that the ship is here in the condition it is. So with all that in mind, the crew decides to just turn the engine on. After doing so, Jim and one of his crewmates basically almost die because coincidentally they are in the reactor room and like they had to do some correspondence with the people on the bridge to make sure everything was okay. Turns out there was a bunch of proto molecules. Keep that in mind. This will become an important plot device later. After turning on the mass reactor, it ended up fueling this weird proto molecule and it basically almost eats the two of them. Like really, it's depicted as like people but not people. It's very interesting. Google an image if you want to see, or I mean of course if you've seen the show. And as if one stroke of bad luck wasn't enough, by turning on the reactor they basically spring the trap for like a stealth ship that was hiding in the cut. The stealth ship gets active, fires a bunch of torpedoes, and ends up destroying the Canterbury. Jim is devastated. Not only that, but their shuttle gets really shaken up in the shockwave because, you know, they're in space. Like, it doesn't matter if it blew up like 1,000 miles away or whatever. That shit is still going to come after you. Yeah, and that's episode 1 for Jim. He gets promoted. He has a falling out with his girlfriend. His girlfriend gets blown up. He gets fucked up in the shockwave, and they're just adrift at space. That's most of the plot that happens in episode 1. Of course, I'm going to cover the other characters, but I just want you to know that it's not nearly going to be as juicy as this. So I guess we'll move over to Christian. As I mentioned earlier, we get a good idea of her socioeconomic standing when we see her playing with her niece or nephew on the property. And of course, her later in the episode where she's torturing the OPA agent. A lot of Christian's screen time goes to meetings with the UN officials, rubbing of elbows, meet and greets, just, you know, the regular schmoozing that happens in the government. I do want to point out that during a lot of that schmoozing that you see throughout the episode, we do get introduced to her boss. Can't remember his title, but his name is Sadavir Ehrenreich. And he's definitely someone to look out for. He is shady as fuck. We'll probably touch on it more in other episodes where we discuss Chris Jen's importance, but yeah, he definitely gives I'm a creep hiding something energy. I could be misremembering, but I think one of the other important things that happen in this episode that Chris Jen specifically contributes towards is the fact that the OPA is trading and or smuggling stealth technology. For the sake of continuity, I'm not going to say who it was with or how they got it. We could discuss that later in the seasonal review, but yeah. A vast majority of the intrigue surrounding the political maneuvering for this episode is just centered around it being stealth technology. You know, what does this mean for the UN? Should they be preparing for war? Do they need to be looking out for moles? It's all pretty interesting, to be honest, but it's just nothing that really contributes to the major plot. That pretty much concludes Christian's involvement in the episode. As far as Joe Miller goes, unfortunately, there's not really a whole lot to talk about there either. The major takeaway from his part of the episode would likely be his assignment on a missing persons case. However, this missing person is not any ordinary Joe Schmo off the street. She's actually an heiress. To who, what, why? We don't know. Alls we know is that she's omega important in the OPA movement. While she's not in the show basically at all until a few episodes towards the end, I think it's like episode 8 and 9, maybe a little bit of 10, she's a huge plot device. Like, She's the driving motivation for almost all of Joe's actions. It's pretty good. It's revealed later on in the season that Joe loved her, I guess. That's really all we get. That's kind of how Joe's character is typed, though. He's like the brooding, quiet, intellectual man's man type. Virtually all the rest of Joe's involvement in the show is like world building on series. He talks to a lot of the locals. It's like his morning routine for most of it. Yeah, that's like his major responsibility in the show at this point, is getting you to feel the environment, the atmosphere of series, how politically unstable it is, how everyone is just always on that and just pissed. On series proper, there's obviously some kind of social hierarchy. Some people have more local power than others, so it's very cool to see for the first time. That's one thing I will say about episode 1, is that while there's not a whole lot of plot going on with Christian or Joe, I do remember enjoying watching their sections a lot. Moving on to episode 2, titled The Big Empty. The title can have a variety of interpretations and meanings depending on who you try to relate it to within the show. For example, if you relate it to Christian, you can say that it represents her feeling towards a revelation that basically everything she holds dear and cares for is now at risk of total annihilation. If you relate it to Jim, it's pretty obvious to see the connection of being lost, basically condemned to die in the vastness of space as the Big Empty. And as it pertains to Joe, in this particular episode, we get a glimpse into his baseline emotional state, how he suffers from feelings of loneliness, and basically what he stands to lose by not finding Julie, the missing heiress. So to start this episode off, I guess we'll take a look at Christian, since she doesn't exactly have the most screen time, but she does move the plot significantly. The plot progression doesn't feel particularly rushed, but it also doesn't feel very rewarding. I think the main problem is just trying to follow up from episode 1. We follow Christian through the episode, continuing the torture of the political prisoner, and she does actually manage to squeeze some intel out of him. The prisoner admits to smuggling advanced stealth technology, supplied to the OPA by the MCR. So Christian gets to have her aha moment and justify the means by which she gets her ends. The news that the OPA are basically trying to militarize themselves for armed conflict with the UN causes quite the stir, unsurprisingly. I can't remember exactly if it was this episode or the next episode that Christian talks to Sadavir Ehrenreich, her boss, about this, but I remember viewing it and seeing kind of the mannerisms that Ehrenreich displayed and immediately thinking, like, yeah, this guy is clearly up to something. So basically, as early as episode 2, we're already getting hints that Ehrenreich is some kind of player to watch. I'm not sure exactly what else Christian does in this episode. Nothing really stands out in my memory, but, you know, she probably does get more screen time. If you're into the whole political maneuvering and shaking their hand with one hand and then having a gun behind your back with the other hand, then you'll really enjoy this part of the episode. With all that being said, that pretty much concludes Christian's contribution of the plot this episode, so we can move on to Joe's involvement in the episode. Joe, it's really more of the same with him. A lot of the screen time we get with him is just him going through daily life in series. The only time there's any real plot relevance going on to the overarching season is when he's investigating directly inside of Julie's apartment. He does his cop thing, he pulls some strings, he finds where her apartment is, breaks in because they're not really cops, they're like the security apparatus for this weird corporate entity. Or perhaps territory, again, not super clear. Anyways, he breaks into the apartment, and he does some snooping. He's in love with her, but you don't really know that at this point in the story, so he's doing some sussy shit, admittedly, but it's, like, supposed to be romantic. Eventually, he ends up finding what is essentially a burner phone, and on it he finds all these different OPA contacts. He deduces that she was sympathetic with like the movement, being an heiress, having obligations, having no true independence. I mean, it all tracks really if you think about it. While looking through the phone, Joe makes the discovery that she made arrangements to be aboard the Scopuli at some point. And if you're paying attention, you remember the Scopuli was the ship that Jim went to go investigate that had the distress signal, so already the stories are trying to weave themselves together. Even more phenomenal writing. Alright, moving on to Jim. So Jim's part in the episode, admittedly, there's not a whole lot of plot happening for a majority of the episode. You know, honestly, it's kind of a nothing burger of an episode. Like, it's the slow drip, it's the falling action after the initial banger setup that episode 1 had. Plot-wise, towards the end of the episode, we see an approach vector for one of the Martian warships that hears the distress signal that Jim and crew are able to hodgepodge together by the end of the episode. And thinking quickly on his feet, while also considering all the different dialogue and back and forths that him and his crew have repairing their banged up little boarding ship following the assassination of the Canterbury, Jim decides that it's in the best interest of himself and his crew basically to pin the entire thing on the MCR. Now, I can play devil's advocate and just recall to you via wiki link or something all the different debates they had about who it could have been, why it could have been, so on and so forth. But basically, in the end, Jim decides that none of it matters because they saw what happened, and if they want to have a shot at explaining this to some kind of larger political body, they need to be able to ensure their safety as political prisoners with the MCR. So it's really more of like a 4D gigabrain move where even though in all likelihood Jim doesn't really believe that the MCR was responsible for the destruction of the Canterbury, he has to basically hold the leverage of being a political prisoner over the MCR. And the way he accomplishes this is just crazy, dude. Like, he's basically completely all in on the plan. So as the Donager, the MCR warship, is approaching, he basically puts out an all-frequency distress call to whoever is listening, like as far as they could broadcast it with the power they have on their shuttle ship. And he just lays it on thick, no preamble, nothing. It's very much, it feels like you're seeing something important whenever you see him deliver it. He basically goes, yeah, I'm the acting captain. I was the XO of the Canterbury. We were responding to a distress call from the Scopuli. They got blown up, but we almost got blown up. We think the MCR did it. They're about to capture us. Cinema. So yeah, that's episode 2. We get a little bit of development as to what the OPA MCR connection is as far as like the OPA spy goes. Joe and Jim get character development that is just established through environmental storytelling and the like. Cinema. Okay, all memes aside, let's move on to episode 3 titled Remember the Cant. Remember the Cant is a pretty interesting title if you start to look at it from an etymology lens. Given the political instability something like Jim's message would cause in an already politically unstable region such as the Belt, the choice of the word cant is very interesting to think about. Of course, there's the obvious connection that the ship's name that Jim was on was the Canterbury, right? But when someone's referring to cant as a form of speech, it's actually used in a bit of a negative light. Historically, it was used as a bit of a slur or a pejorative towards someone in an outgroup. Kind of the way we refer to Pig Latin, but with a lot more baggage attached to it. And given there's so much political animosity bubbling up at this time in the story, it makes sense that on a deeper level, the episode would be called Remember the Cant, because sometimes it's hard to forget when you're wronged. I just find it funny to imagine, like, an earthling, you know, just like a regular looking person yelling like a pejorative, like, shut up with your can't to some fucking gangly, weird looking belter, dude. But yeah, there's plenty to talk about in this episode. Christian does a really good job about moving the plot forward. We get to learn a lot more about her, where her moral lines are, whether she's willing to cross them, how difficult it is for her to cross them. Plenty to talk about. So let's just jump in. So sitting on this information that the OPA operative provided Christian starts to plot in ways to verify the validity of it. And this is where we see truly how capable she is. One of her longtime friends / UN associates happens to be an ambassador for Mars. Basically, she confides in him like all the things that she's learned and lies and says, yeah, we've got proof that it was Mars. This then sends him into a panic to contact Mars and his secret underground network of people, and basically causes him to play his hand unwittingly, because Christian, with the help of Ehrenreich, her boss, are actually monitoring his comms. What they end up finding out as a result of this is that Mars is actually completely guilt-free in this regard. So what could that mean? Some operating deep state, or even just one powerful individual, is trying to create a cause belli for war with Mars. To what end, we don't really know, but it's very suspicious, and I told you to look out for Ehrenreich. That motherfucker is suspicious. And as far as plot relevance goes, that's basically it for Christian, but huge movement. As far as her character goes, I think it pretty much speaks for itself. She sold out a longtime friend, basically on the off chance that he might know something about something. As a result of this security breach between his communication with Mars, he gets banned from Mars. And this is a huge deal for him. In the short time that we get to see him, like, he and his husband planned on retiring there, like all their future prospects were there. It's kind of fucked up, honestly. And as the icing on the cake, he ends up getting politically assassinated. Obviously, it's made to look like some kind of accident or something, but in a very real sense, Christian kills this man off of a hunch. So, a lot to talk about, really. A lot to consider, to think about with Christian's character. Is she really ruthless? Is she doing all this for the sake and protection of her family? How invested into the perpetuity of her own power structure is all this taken into consideration? So far, I hope it's come across that I do enjoy Christian's character and her characterization, her personality, how she moves through the world, how she interacts with the world, but there's not a whole lot of plot relevance that she contributes to. I really do feel like she's being set up to be a major player in the rest of the series. Well, that about wraps up Christian for now, so we'll move on to Joe. So Joe, like many of the other Belters, saw Jim's initial broadcast as it was happening. Having recently discovered his first clue about where Julie might be, he recognized the name Scopuli and put it together that, oh yeah, well, she's obviously involved in this somehow. So after a bit of chasing down dead leads, cold leads, he ends up just cutting straight to the source. Basically, he heads down to the main OPA area of Ceres. Again, it's not really an official political body or anything like that, I don't think, at least. But word around the station locally is that the OPA's liaison, Anderson Dawes, is around a certain part of the station. Now, the reason I'm naming him is because he is going to be a little bit relevant throughout the season. Anyways, Joe heads over to that part of the station to confront him about what happened to Julie. Ultimately, nothing comes from it, but the introduction itself of Anderson Dawes is a really well done scene. Joe arrives to that part of the station where it's kind of got an OPA vibe to it, and the first thing he's confronted with is this weird, almost Che Guevara-esque mural of Jim. It's only been a matter of hours, and people are already becoming radicalized and revolutionary, and it's pretty interesting to see, honestly. Shortly after this, Joe's trying to locate where exactly Anderson is, and while he's doing that, a sort of scuffle evolves into a larger, almost hate crime on someone who doesn't have the same kind of ideology as the OPA. And like magic pixie dust, Anderson just comes out the cut and is like, oh no, guys, we shouldn't be doing this, hitting all the revolutionary talking points. However, from his demeanor, it doesn't seem to be disingenuous. It seems like he really is a believer in the cause. This is only further reinforced whenever he and Joe have a conversation later that ultimately is fruitless for Joe. However, even Joe seems moved, and he's like your typical cynical cop. Maybe moved is too strong of a word, but he definitely seemed considerate. So, shortly after leaving the OPA area of the station, you can tell the atmosphere of the station is much more electric. It's almost as if that little scuffle that occurred there is just a smaller microcosm of what's really happening throughout the station. There's organizers out in the street, there's protesters, people are openly marching. At the very least, it's going to turn into a small-scale revolt, but it could spiral into outright revolution. Now, it's important to note that this isn't entirely because of the political events that have been unfolding. It's more of a perfect storm of them not having enough water at the moment and the political landscape shifting so rapidly. With the Canterbury and Scopuli being completely destroyed, their weekly or monthly, however it works, their water rationing has to be cut back significantly. Ultimately, how this will spiral with political implications is yet to be seen, but the people do openly riot later on into the episode. And I believe that covers all the major points for Joe in episode 3. So let's move on to Jim. We find Jim and crew basically being brought aboard the Donager, the MCR warship. Once aboard, they're detained and taken through, I guess what you would say, standard MCR interrogation is. This consists of separating the crew into their own cells and then doing individual one-on-one interrogation. So this is the first episode, more or less, where we get to really see the MCR at all. Up until this point in the show, we've never seen a Martian, period. So this episode does a lot of legwork in demonstrating Martian values, some urban legend around them at certain points. It really does a good job at characterizing what you would imagine in your mind to be whenever you hear the word Martian. For example, at one point during the episode, one of Jim's crew members tries to taunt one of the Martian guards. And Amos, I guess you would say the characterization he has is that he's like the wild card of the crew. Although I guess it would be more apt to say that he's like the resident killer, like he's stone cold in his demeanor and his approach to his crewmates. Also, he just doesn't mind killing. But anyways, Amos basically taunts this guard in the context of like joking around with one of his crewmates. He says something to the effect of, oh, you didn't know Martians don't have balls, they get them cut off when they join the service. Which is crazy to think because, even if it is like a majority part propaganda on the UN side, I think it speaks more to the perception of the Martian government at that point, because typically with totalitarian or authoritarian societies, it's really easy to make these blanket claims like that. Like if you think about the real world example of that would be like probably the way that the USSR had propaganda against Americans at the time, but it was never warmongering or even that extreme just in its raw expression. They would call us American pigs, dog is for consumerism and things like that. But, when you think about a more modern take of that on how, let's say, the North Koreans would view Americans, it's like, yeah, I mean, they say some pretty vile things, but, the propaganda in itself is usually based or couched within what the competing ideologies have the most conflict in. So for Amos to just say, like, yeah, they don't have their balls anymore, and the fact that they live on, we could say, within the grand scheme of things, like when you compare Earth and Mars's ecological environment, like, yeah, maybe they do really have to enforce some kind of population control. Now, look, I get it. I might be overanalyzing just some random improvised line or some what could very well be legitimate just shit-talking between two cishet norm guys, but the way I read the scene and the way that the actor portrayed the specific. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into the scene, but it seemed like there was some truth to what he was saying, like, whenever someone burns you or digs you just the right way, and you could tell, like, if you see it happen, if you're the third party observer, if you see someone get burned just right, you could tell that shit really got him. But yeah, other than being a backdrop for learning more about the Martians, this episode serves to really flesh out the rest of Jim's surviving crew, which is great to see in the show, believe me, but there's not a real big impact that the crew makes on Jim's character development as a whole, and I guess this is a good place to speak on it holistically within season 1 at least. I feel like Jim and Joe both coincidentally suffer or benefit, depending on how you look at it, from the same kind of character motivation. On the one hand, Jim just wants to keep his crew alive, right? So if we take into consideration everything we know about his character from the beginning of the show until now, basically he was a kid born out of obligation who was more or less ejected from the one place that he could somewhat call home. Then the only real opportunity he would have was to be beholden to another thing with more obligation, being, the United Nations Navy. And then he failed spectacularly at that. So when he gets out to the belt initially at Ceres, he's really not looking to take on any kind of responsibility or anything like that. He's just really trying to find his groove, which he does successfully. He finds a crew that he really vibes with. He becomes a respectable part of the crew. People start looking at him to take roles of responsibility. Like, for example, whenever the EXO went crazy and the captain wanted to promote him. And above all else, he found what he was presuming would be some kind of long-term permanent partner as well. So for all that to go up in flames completely out of the blue for him, just everything went sideways crazy fast. And then to be thrust into like a life or death situation following that and being the person in charge of everything, basically his crew serves as like the impetus for him to continue living at this point, along with some vague idea of revenge, in my opinion at least. And to the flip side of that, with Joe, this guy is just some loser orphan from a mining station. If we're going off of what the show has told us at this point, he's got no family, he has little money, and even less friends. But he did have a lover, or at least someone he loved. So he's got to get her back. I would draw the comparison that both of these guys are guys who are not living to live, they are living for the sake of something. All that to say, while it is nice to get to know the characters more if you're watching the show, for the sake of the review, they don't really affect Jim's character, so to speak. It's just that the concern he shows to them throughout the episode is mainly a result of them being his driving motivation, for now at least, simply to the fact that they are all he has left now. Keeping all that in mind, I'd like to examine Jim's own experience with the interrogation. During the interrogation, we do get a couple more hints at perhaps the values that the MCR holds at large, given their unique position within the political structure. The Donagers EXO, I believe, so the Donagers Jim enters the interrogation room with almost an air of superiority, which is interesting to note. But the real meat of the inference comes when he takes some kind of stimulant drug. This alone, I think, speaks the most volume of anything we've seen for the MCR. Only in times of dire straits or great necessity do we see the permission of service members using drugs, in liberal societies at least. Or if you want to infer even further, only a society that is not the hegemonic power would find there to be a necessity to amp their military in such a way. But the type of state that would need this the most, in my opinion, would be an authoritarian state, which only lends more credence to my initial reaction or intuition towards Amos's mythology about Mars. I mean, does it seem so unreasonable of a jump in logic that a state that would allow certain privileges or certain exceptions to societal norm to literally require something as extreme as body modification? But Martian speculation aside, this Martian commander's interrogation of Jim and his crewmates mainly serves to thematically challenge Jim's motivation at a core level. You see, the stimulant drug that the Martian commander took is actually basically the Limitless drug. I don't know if you ever saw that movie with Jennifer Lawrence and that other white guy from The Hangover, but essentially what it appears to do, on screen at least, is enhance this guy's perception so drastically it's impossible to lie to him. So really everything that this Martian commander is asking Jim, like, oh, how well do you know your crew? Oh yeah, this guy already sold you out. Yeah, this guy, did you know about this chick? She's actually an OPA operative. So a lot of it is really just to challenge Jim's core foundational motivation. Because it turns out if you even have a little bit of doubt, even the smallest bit of doubt, he's going to be able to read it on you. But Jim never breaks, so clearly his commitment to his crew is just astronomical. So the Martian commander basically loses at the game he's trying to play with Jim. The whole time he's trying to leverage Jim and pressure him into basically retracting the statement because I guess the MCR is like not entirely unsure if the MCR is actually responsible for it. It's pretty funny when you think about it, but yeah, it either shines light on their incompetence or how many other shadowy special ops, wet work kind of things they have going on. And that's basically all the plot and character development for Jim in episode 3. The episode ends proper with a shot of the stealth ships lurking on the MCR ship, the Donager. So yeah, that's crazy. How long have those been there? It really goes to demonstrate how much more advanced the tech is than the MCR. And that brings us into episode 4, CQB. For those who have lived a healthy, balanced life, CQB typically stands for Close Quarters Battle, and it is exactly what it sounds like. So for this episode, Christian is going to be completely absent, and there's only a bit of intrigue that really sets up the payoff for episode 5 for Joe, so we'll just cover that real quick. As I mentioned in my episode 3 review for Joe on Remember the Can't, there's that big riot that happened. To make a long story short, one of his buddies ends up getting jumped by a gang of, I guess, I don't want to say Russians, but they speak Russian. It has some plot relevance, but it's more so for like, ultimately the race or the affiliation of the gang doesn't really matter. It matters a little bit for inter-character drama, but for the sake of the review, it doesn't matter ultimately. Just know that Joe's buddy gets jumped and nearly killed by this gang. As a result of this other friend of Joe's being out of commission for this episode, he ends up working with one of his other close friend partner type people. I don't know if in an official capacity they are partners, but they do work well together. Because she's going to have a little bit of plot relevance later, we will name her character. Her name is Octavia Muss, but we'll just call her Octavia. And Octavia's character is pretty great. Not because of like holistically like her character. She's kind of a one note accenting supporting character. Basically, and I don't want to make small or light of her character, but essentially she exists as like the voice of reason and grounding for Joe. Later on in the show, we see that Joe had one really good partner who ended up getting kicked out of the force. And basically, ever since then, he's been like lacking that grounding element. So he's a bit of a wild card, as we know. He's the loner, intelligent, kind of Batman type, but Octavia really comes to shine in and help him out in the investigation. Basically, looking at the case from another angle, from just a new, fresh perspective, she's able to go through Julia's dating profiles. So like her Tinder, Bumbles, whatever, Space Bumble, right? And she ends up discovering that she met a guy who ended up being a data broker that they find the dead body of amongst the rioters. And because it's the future and weird and semi-cyberpunk, the data broker has like a lot of augmentations to his body, like genetic enhancements, cyborg implants, like what they refer to as like a black box of data for him. Apparently, it's pretty standard procedure for most outlaws to have this if they're in like the data brokerage space. So they end up removing that from his body, and it's a pretty good scene. It's a little disgusting to be honest, but the show has that kind of horror element since you're existing in space. Like hella shit can go wrong out of nowhere. So basically, this just leads to a conclusion that both Octavia and Joe come to, that whatever Julia was involved with is clearly much bigger than they ever thought. Like, yeah, sure, she's a missing heiress, but to be connected with the OPA and all this other stuff and to suddenly be disappeared after you meet a data broker, it's like, what's really going on? And that's basically where we end it with Joe. He's sitting on this new pile of data that can't exactly get into immediately because he's got to do some quantum code cracking or something like that. So he's basically left to stew with what could have happened to Julie, what could she be involved in. So it's a bit of a waiting game for him, and it really shines light on certain aspects of his character. So now we could talk about Jim's part of the episode, and boy, am I excited to talk about it. Oh man, guys. Let me tell you one thing about me. I'm a sucker for a good fight. But when it's a good fight done well, done realistically, done in good faith, it's up for me. And one thing the Expanse gets right, almost down to a T, is the space combat. But Henry, how do you know? Yeah, well, let me tell you something. When you've seen enough sci-fi as I have, when you've seen basically every Gundam that's come out, when you've seen every mecha that's come out, when you just are so enamored with big machines moving in weird, uncanny, absurd ways, then you develop a good eye for this. And if you've enjoyed enough sci-fi, then you'll know that space combat is never this big flashy spectacle. Oh, I'm Star Wars, I'm actually fantasy masquerading as sci-fi. Yeah, I said it. You'll know that it's typically depicted as like what I imagine actually experiencing like World War II era Navy battle would be like, except on a third axis, and you don't always know where everything is. And that's more or less how the fight starts. These advanced stealth ships come out of stealth, I guess, take the Martians completely by surprise, fight unconventionally, and not just in the tactics, but like at one point in the battle, the one ship breaks into 6 ships, confuses the fuck out of the Martians. Their tech is way more advanced, and Mars is actually like the leader in military hardware in a way. I don't know. They kind of talk about it in one of the episodes, but I can't remember if it was before this or after this. And they just blitz the hell out of them, and they get into CQB range, as it's referred to by one of Jim's crew members. So it turns into a real unconventional fight, like almost off rip. It's during the fight that one of Jim's crewmates get eviscerated by one of the railgun shots. Pretty graphic, but also, you know, I'm not going to say cool, but a very interesting depiction of what a body does in space. Eventually, after enough CQB, the mystery ships, the stealth fighters, incur enough damage that they determine that boarding is now an acceptable option. So they board the Donager, and the Donager captain sees the writing on the wall and basically tells Jim, you gotta get to somewhere else real quick with this data drive. And on the data drive is just all the combat data they've got on the mystery ships up to this point, because they're like really kicking the Martians' ass. So the captain orders the XO, the guy who is interrogating Jim, to escort Jim at all costs. Like, he's just got to get out of here with this data drive. Also, the leverage that he has as a political prisoner with all the eyewitness information on these random, assumably OPA ships, and their involvement with the Scopuli and the Canterbury still needs to be resolved. So Jim is like priority number 1 for the entire crew of the Donager. The rest of the episode basically consists of Jim, his escort guard of Martians, and his crew just trying to fight their way off the ship. Eventually, they manage it, and they escape the vessel right as it's about to self-destruct because, I don't know, I guess that's the way the Martians roll. And that's pretty much it. They get away from the fight. The blast from the Donager takes out virtually everything. I mean, there's clearly a bunch of debris, but there would be no way to really determine, like, oh yeah, this little piece is from, it doesn't look like anything we have, it's probably the stealth ship. So effectively, the enemy, like the shadow government or whatever organization is pulling the strings on the war, it's still a mystery. The episode ends proper by showing us a new character in the series whose name is Fred Johnson. The reason I give him a name, I name him as a character, is because he's going to be relevant throughout the next foreseeable future. I mean, he doesn't have a whole lot going on in season 1, but I classify him the same way as I do Christian. He's probably going to be pretty important. So we see this new character, Fred Johnson, at a place called Tycho Station. As far as it's made clear in season 1, Tycho Station is some kind of mega project shipyard, and Fred Johnson is like the chief operator of it. The only thing at this point in the series to make of note with Fred Johnson is that there's some kind of loose, vague, open secret connection between him and the OPA. And that's really all we have for CQB. Bit of a shorter analysis, but it was a visual spectacle, so let your peepers do the talking. Wow, guess what, guys? We've officially hit the halfway point. Yay! The falling action for season 1 is actually quite good, so buckle up, we're almost there. Up next we have episode 5, Back to the Butcher. As you could probably already tell, I try to find some deeper connection to the episode or media at large with the episode titles. However, I can't really discern any connection with Back to the Butcher with the media landscape at large. It appears to just be in reference to Fred Johnson himself, which we could talk about in a minute. Another thing to note with this episode is that Christian appears to be completely absent from it. I really tried to remember if she had anything to do with this episode, and I can't remember, so forgive me if I'm leaving her out, but I'm pretty sure this is just a Jim Joe episode. So we'll start off with the story beats from Jim. The last we saw Jim and crew, he was escaping from the Donager as it was self-destructing against the stealth ships. With limited fuel and even more limited options, in a desperate situation, Jim and crew receive a transmission from Tycho Station. The transmission consists of an offer of refuge and asylum from the MCR offered by the OPA, and it turns out that Fred Johnson is actually, like, maybe not the liaison, but like a high-ranking official within the OPA. While we're talking about Fred Johnson, perhaps it's a good time to discuss his backstory a little bit. The title of the episode is in direct relation to Fred Johnson, as I mentioned earlier. The sum total of characterization and background we get for Fred Johnson in just season 1 isn't a lot to go on, admittedly. However, what we do find out is that he gets his nickname as the Butcher because of his ruthless methods while he served in the United Nations Navy. Yeah, you heard that right. He was a commander or a colonel or something, some high rank in the United Nations Navy. My take on this is that he's probably trying to absolve himself from past sins or something like that. If you've done enough damage, collateral damage at least, to civilians that you get the name the Butcher, then, you know, things are looking grim for you. However, as we'll discuss in later episode analysis, he really does seem to carry a certain staunch belief in the OPA movement at large. One of the more compelling characters in my opinion. So with Fred Johnson's reputation preceding him, and being in Jim's position, having received this invitation of asylum and refuge from him, it already makes you hesitant as to what the devil's bargain is going to be. What is he going to want from you in return? Is it all just a ruse to capture your ship? The OPA would do a lot to get their hands on MCR technology, or really any advantage that they could hold over the UN. This leads to a lot of good dialogue and debate amongst Jim and his crew. Obviously, I can't go over all of it right now, but eventually they do decide to at least dock at Tycho Station. Yeah, not a whole lot to talk about as far as reviewing goes, but the episode itself, I do remember enjoying a lot. It's very strong, gives you a lot of world building, a lot of good dialogue. So, yeah, it's definitely not a bad episode. It's just for the sake of the review, we could actually move past a majority of it. That being said, that does conclude Jim's part of the episode, so we can move on to Joe's part. Joe's part of the episode is actually what I would consider to be like the core theming or like the core vibe that the show is trying to go for in season one. It's just loaded to the brim with intrigue, plotting, political maneuvering. It's very well done. So while Joe's waiting to decipher the data that he got from that dead dude, he decides to go visit one of his buddies who got jumped by those Russian guys. And we get even more insight into Joe's character. Honestly, he's like a frontrunner for my favorite in season one. It's a real close tie between Jim and Joe because I don't want to spoil anything, but we'll get there when we get there. So Joe gets to the hospital room that his buddy's being treated in. And I'm not gonna lie, Joe gets a little bit racist. You see Joe's buddy, it was established earlier in the show, but I mean, like, it doesn't really have plot relevance except for this one moment for character drama. But Joe's buddy has a lover who is a prostitute, and she is Russian, or whatever the hell the nationality is. But when I say lover, I mean, like, for real, they love each other. He's learning Russian for her. There's actually a cute moment right before he fucking almost dies and gets jumped where he does this weird Russian greeting or something, but he fucks it up and they kill him anyways, or they try to kill him at least. But yeah, they are really about that life. So when Joe starts to pop off and be like, oh, don't you know she's just using you, she's getting in your head, what do you think she's telling those guys who tried to kill you after you leave the room, like da-da-da-da-da, just trying to get into his head, which admittedly, you know, there's some validity to that. Like, you can't just disregard any possibility in the face of love. It would be nice if you could do that, but yeah, it really gets underneath his buddy's skin. He starts raising his voice at her. Joe does. Joe starts raising his voice at her, and then the buddy's like, "Don't fucking talk to her like that." It's funny. It's like your regular soap opera drama shit, and it's nice. It's a nice little touch whenever the stakes are the entire solar system, so I enjoyed it. So we do get to see a side of Joe that is protective, that as much as he wants to have this persona, this facade of being a loner, like clearly he does really care for the people he cares about. Also, he could turn up that racism when he wants. Not really, but kinda. But yeah, he ends up leaving the hospital room. Things are kind of cool. They're cool in the fact that, like, you know, what was said, but him and his boy aren't going to stop being boys because of it. It's at this point during the episode that Joe starts to chase down smaller leads that ultimately amount to nothing in this episode, but it's all been stacked upon in the previous episodes. Like, for example, whenever Joe first meets Anderson, the OPA liaison in that one part of the station that's like OPA oriented, he asks around about her initially, and someone just randomly happened to know about her. He's like, oh yeah, that Julie chick, yeah, she flipped this guy with some judo, it was crazy. There's also another lead that he follows up on that he got from the data broker's dead body logs or something like that. That takes him to a trap house, like an actual trap house, and yeah, he ends up seeing like some space NASCAR, and this guy fucking like flies into the atmosphere too quickly and blows up or something. It's nice. It's good world building, but ultimately, like, you know, I bring it up because the world building's actually a nice touch. Do I necessarily go into a story wanting to see what Space Trap House is like? Nah, not really, but it's cool that I got to see it. But yeah, that ultimately leads to a dead end. Eventually, he does follow up on that one lead about Julie judo flipping that guy. He ends up getting the security camera footage on the dock whenever it happened, and he's able to do future CSI Miami zooms onto his face and get all his records, and it's real cool to see. Like, obviously very scary if like a police state has that kind of power, but fuck around, find out, I guess. Yeah, it ends up being like a space Uber driver who does crime for the OPA. With the data still not being decrypted and a new lead in hand, Joe decides to go find this guy. Because Joe is like a light alcoholic, he stops at a bar or something. I can't remember, but he was gearing up to go get this guy. And guess who shows up to grease his gears? Anderson Dog. Jaws. I gotta put respect on his name because, again, I do think he's a cool character. He's like a fiefdom kind of a character, you know? He's like, I don't know if he's really seizing on the power or if he believes in the OPA movement itself, but he's like a big deal on this specific part of the station. He's a cool guy. Like, I enjoy him being on screen. So Anderson comes out the cut and is like, hey, I have my ear to the ground. This is my part of the station. What's this I hear about you trudging up this Neville guy? And Neville's like the space crime Uber driver. Joe is basically more or less like, mind your business, don't worry about it, like, this is an official investigation. And then Anderson's like, bitch, I'm official, this is my part of the station. It's good. It's like, there's a underlying combative element, like they're politicking, and I enjoy seeing that, so it's a good part of the scene. Eventually, after posturing enough, Anderson offers Joe a proposition. He's like, hey, I know those dudes who jumped your boy. I know those Russian guys, and it wouldn't be too bad of a problem if they just ended up disappearing. Like, I could set you up with that. I know where they're hiding out at. I could arrange some stuff. It'll be quick and clean, easy. You could just pat your hands twice and you'll be done with it. The only catch is you have to stop with this Julie nonsense. Like, this is our business. You shouldn't be getting involved with it. Basically letting them know, like, hey, don't go sniffing too far. Obviously, this is only going to further incentivize Joe to find the truth, so ultimately he rejects the offer. He's like, nah, you know, my boy's alive, that's good enough. Like, he's got his Russian baddie, so, you know, more power to him. Pushing on into known dangerous territory at this point, Joe basically goes full steam ahead directly to Neville's hideout. I say hideout like he's a big player in the story. I don't know if he becomes a big player, but it's just like a shitty underground garage, auto shop, apartment all in one kind of a thing. So Joe gets on his Batman timing and starts intimidating him, questioning him. Eventually, he does find out some pretty crucial information. I don't know exactly how Neville would know this unless Julie was using him as like some soundboard confidant like you would normally do whenever you're taking a taxi or an Uber. But basically, Neville knows exactly where she stashed her data that she got from the data broker, the guy who ended up getting killed in the riot. So now Joe's basically hit the Omega gold mine of information. Not only is he going to have the info that eventually he'll decrypt from the data broker, but he has the data that Julie in particular was interested in. I don't remember the exact timeline, how quickly afterwards it happened, but I do remember it happening for sure. Joe gets black bagged. Like 4 people pull up on him. He's got the bag over his head, gagged and restrained, all before he could even, like, figure out what's happening. Gets thrown into, like, a hover van. Like, it says candy inside on the side of it. It's kind of weird. But yeah, that's basically episode 5 in a nutshell. Very Joe-heavy episode, but I'm here for it. Personally, I think Joe's part of the story is, like, some of the most fun to watch. Moving on, we can start talking about episode 6, Rock Bottom. I feel Rock Bottom, the title, has a lot to do with the episode itself and the theming. While we could talk about the moral and character implication later, Jim does end up working with Fred, so in a way he's hit his rock bottom, not really having any sense of moral compass anymore. Joe gets kidnapped, obviously a pretty low point, rock bottom, don't really have a lot of options. And Christian hits even lower lows because she basically blackmails a bunch of people in the UN to find people who have connections to spies in the OPA, and then she blackmails those people to get their spies to spy on Fred for her. So yeah, a lot of blackmail, a lot of low points. I think Rock Bottom is like a pretty apt name for the theming of the episode. So yeah, I mean, we could start with Christian because there's not really a whole lot to add to the statement I just said. Obviously, she does go through the round. She finds all her people that she can to work with to blackmail other people that she has to strong arm into doing what she wants. And eventually she does succeed. She makes enough mad deals, you know, mutually assured destruction. Hey, I got this dirt on you. I know this. You got this dirt on me, yada yada. That she eventually is able to secure one spy on Tycho Station with the explicit orders of monitoring Fred Johnson. Christian's already come to the conclusion, like she's already intuited in her own mind that Fred Johnson is most likely the person responsible for the Canterbury's destruction. How exactly she gets there, I can't remember, but it seemed convincing enough to me. Like, I remember watching it and having the vague recollection of like being in agreement with her. It didn't inherently jump out to me as like a giant stretch. Now, the real big reveal for Christian this episode is finding out the reason why she has so much animosity and suspicion towards the OPA. Basically, just to give some more context, it is somewhat what I theorized before. Through the dialogue that happens throughout this episode, it's basically confirmed, but not directly stated, that there has been this new emerged plutocratic class within the UN on Earth. Not the biggest reveal of the episode, but for me personally, this is something I've been interested in with this show since the beginning. I love it when a show takes the time to sit in and investigate its own politics. But the real meat of her character and why I think Christian has felt kind of vapid or one note up until this point gets revealed to us. Basically, with the context that I stated about having like a plutocratic class, like a well-to-do class who kind of manages the overarching like macro of the society, you can have all the material comfort and condition in the world, but if the people don't trust you, you still won't get elected. Within the context of the show, there's still this small veil of meritocracy that persists, thankfully. So even if your family business, so to speak, is being in politics, you would still need to go through certain rites of passage, such as being academically gifted, performing some kind of civil service, and then eventually running for some kind of political campaign. Well, as it turns out, her son, who was, trying to follow in the family business, decided that his civil service would be in the UNN, the United Nations Navy. Unfortunately, the world is an unfair and cruel place. Once you put on the uniform, it doesn't matter where you come from or how wealthy you were, you're still going to serve the same kind of duty that everyone else does. Well, unfortunately, while out on patrol or tour or whatever you want to call it throughout the belt, Christian's son was a part of a military action against a group of rebels belonging to the OPA. And eventually he died in battle with them. So that explains a lot of Christian's character up to this point. The reason she throws herself so ruthlessly into politics and progressing up the UN chain of command is because simply she has nothing else. Perhaps the reason she finds it so important to overachieve even more so than what was perhaps previously done in her lineage is because she's doing it for someone else as well. All the suspicion and animosity she holds towards the OPA is directly related to her grief, probably unresolved grief, that she has over her son. So many things just line up perfectly for her character. It's a really well done aha moment because you could tell some things she's off canny. She's off canny throughout the whole show, and you can't really put your finger on what it is. With the revelation that she had her son taken away from her so early in life, it's tragic, but goddamn if it's not a good character moment. Anyways, on to Jim's part. So Jim and crew end up arriving on Tycho Station. The initial scene of Jim and Amos, the crazy cold-blooded guy I talked about a couple episodes ago, is just so well done. There's this unspoken mind game happening whenever Jim and Amos first meet Fred, and it really gives you insight into the kind of guy that Fred is, or at least the guy that Fred tries to politic as. When all three of them first meet each other, they're right on top of the airlock for the Tachi, the ship that Jim and co. escaped with, and no one really wants to say what everyone's thinking. Fred's trying to tiptoe around the situation and throw him softballs like, oh, what are you doing with this weird MCR ship? There's no way this ship could have gotten anywhere between stations, pretending like he wasn't just watching them with the best scanning arrays in the belt. And Jim and Amos are being real squirrely, not trying to give any definitive answers to box them into a story. Eventually, after a couple minutes of this, Amos just fucking gives up and is like, I'll just be violent if that's what you want. I'll just be a violent person. Jim tries to reel him in, but Amos is already too far gone. He's like, he's just going crazy. It's actually Fred that diffuses this in the coolest way possible. He basically stances up on him and is like, yeah, you could shoot me, but then what? Eventually, they all do come to an agreement and lay out a couple ground rules for how they're going to cooperate. In exchange for helping them at all, Fred basically demands that he gets the thumb drive with all the battle data on it. Jim is initially reluctant, of course, but without any real political bargaining power, then he just has to concede to it. The main thing Jim keeps repeating and doubling down on is how many Martians died to get this data to where it needs to go. And I think this speaks real volumes to Jim's morality and sense of duty as a character. Having served himself, even for how brief of a stint it was, he can't help but feel the true weight of the debt that he owes them, perhaps. Fred doesn't give a damn, though, so yeah, he has to just give it up. Another one of Fred's demands are to go and retrieve Julie, the missing heiress that Joe's investigating. Jim and company being hesitant to risk their lives yet again for someone that they really don't even know or understand the importance of, convince Fred to give up enough information so they feel comfortable getting on board with the plan. It is at this point that things really start popping off. Without giving up too many OPA secrets given Fred's unique positioning within the organization, Fred discloses to Jim and his crew that he was in charge of chartering the flight path for the Scopuli. He claims he doesn't know what the cargo was truly, but he might be feigning ignorance. With this new information, Jim now becomes fully on board with the plan. The way Jim sees this is his one opportunity to find out what really happened to the Canterbury, or rather, who's really responsible for the destruction of it, along with the death of his lover. So what is the plan exactly? Basically, given that Fred has the charter information for the flight path of the Scopuli, as well as the coordinates for where they initially began to be intercepted, and lastly, the initial rendezvous point, Fred basically was able to narrow down where they could be hiding and where they could be in space. The only catch is that the area of space that they're going to be searching in is Martian controlled. And with the Donager blowing up from random stealth fighters, things are not going to be easy. So to be able to sneak into that area of space, they got to do two things. Disguise all functionality and appearance of the ship, and pray for a miracle. They go about this by welding a bunch of shit to the outside of their ship and disguising their communication signature. To put it short, so that it's not a bunch of sci-fi mumbo-jumbo, basically whenever they talk to each other in space and they send transmissions between each other, each transmission they send has what is essentially an electronic signature embedded in it. So all they gotta do is weld some stuff and make their ship look different, and forge some transportation documentation. And pray no one can tell that their little electric signature is a fake. Pretty simple, right? So with Jim feeling good about the plan, he orders the rest of his crew to get some R&R before they need to ship out. Shouldn't be too long, we don't really get a timeline, but they're just welding some stuff and then basically hacking the ship. So Jim decides to go to the bar with one of his crewmates and just hang out and have a good time. While at the bar, we see some creep with a camera eye spying on Jim, and lo and behold, all the stories are starting to weave together. It's Christian Spy, if you can't tell. Why is he spying on Jim and not Fred? Is he a double agent? Is he a triple agent? Does any of it even matter? Who knows? But yeah, that's Jim's part of the episode. Kind of an interesting twist on the rock bottom take. Like, yeah, he had to forfeit some of his moral righteousness to be able to work with Fred, but only once you've hit rock bottom is the only way up. But Joe is for real in rock bottom. He's been kidnapped by Anderson Dawes, that guy, that dude, that boy. At the end of the day, it's really just Anderson making sure his business is clean. And to do that, well, Joe's going to take a trip out the airlock. He really was about to get spaced until he got saved by his one friend, Octavia. She smokes the dudes who were just standing around laughing at him, then stops the airlock from opening just before he gets spaced. So he's really beat up. Obviously, he's being hunted by the OPAs, so they decide to go to Julie's apartment. Why they thought that was a good idea when she's embedded in the OPA? Who knows? But things work out. Octavia's nursing him back to health. She's having a mental breakdown from having shot two people for the first time. It's a really touching moment between the two of them, and it shows you more of Joe's soft side. A little bit later in the scene, while they're both trying not to have mental breakdowns, the data finally finishes decoding. And the main thing we want to take away from this is that the Scopuli isn't a hapless victim in this. The Scopuli, the ship that Fred chartered and that Julie was captaining, I guess, actually intercepted another ship called the Anubis mid-flight. With all the data that Joe's been able to pull together, he's basically able to deduce that there's some kind of bioweapon being fought over here. And for the sake of cohesion in the review, I will just reveal it here for you. It's the protocules I was talking about way earlier in the show. But the important thing to note is that at this part of the show, no one knows what protocules are. And it's just speculation that it is a bioweapon in particular. So with all this in hand, Joe brings this to what is functionally his police chief, and she's bought out by the OPA. Immediately sussy. Hitting him with all the classics. Who have you told about this? Who else knows about this? Did you make any copies? Next thing you know, it's give me your badge, you're out of here, security, rough him up. So now that Joe actually has something actionable he could go off of, real evidence, not only has he lost it, but he's also lost his authority within the station. Tough shit, I guess. Just one rock bottom into another rock bottom into another rock bottom. Poor Joe can't catch a break. And that'll do it for rock bottom. Which leads us perfectly into episode 7, Windmills. I'm going to be honest with you guys, I don't know what kind of correlation this episode title has. I really sat on it for probably like the better part of a day while I was at work thinking about what I'm going to talk about today, and I just couldn't draw any comparisons. If it's something really obvious that just went over my head, please let me know, but, I just couldn't nail it down. So to start off the analysis for Windmills, I think it does us well to look at Jim's part of the story first. With the retrofit of their frigate that they escaped on complete, the newly christened Rocinante is ready to go. For a majority of the time that they're en route to the Scopuli and Anubis' last known location, everything is going perfectly. They cross all of the neutral space perfectly fine, they even get over the threshold for the MCR space too. It's not until a slight hiccup occurs with the communications array that they become noticed and audited by MCR patrols. Of course, after something so catastrophic happens, someone from the crew would go investigate it. But unfortunately, it turned out to be Amos. And say it with me, guys, Amos is the cold-blooded killer I mentioned earlier. Forgive me for constantly putting that as a reference point for his characterization, but it's really all Bud has going for him. So while he's neck deep in the communications hardware and in the real interior of the ship, he actually gets jumped by the spy that Christian has tailing them. I know I stated earlier that the spy was sent orders explicitly to spy on Fred, but if I had to guess, if you're a spy worthy of the highest orders of the UN to employ, naturally you'd be able to extrapolate on what the greater mission plan is. So by seeing Jim and co being the actual movers of the plan and where, let's say, the big action's going to happen next, of course he's going to go spy on them. So after a bit of a struggle, a tussle even, you could say, Amos ends up subduing the spy. The spy does have a name, but he doesn't make it to season 2, and his purpose within the show is more so just to highlight Jim's moral philosophy, ideology. You'll see what I mean later whenever we get to that part of the show. So yeah, he's dragged up to the bridge by Amos, and they have a deliberation about what to do with him. Jim proposes to just restrain him, keep an eye on him, and to give him basic human dignity. Basically, don't do anything rash, you don't need to jettison him out of the airlock, we just need to keep him alive and see what he's got going on. While on the other hand, Amos just strictly wants him dead, if not dead, in a position so compromised that he has no recourse whatsoever. So the happy medium they decide on is keeping him in the cargo bay airlock, and just if anything goes wrong, if he's doing anything fucky, then you just go kiss space, bitch. And this also gives us an insight into Jim's character a little bit further, which will be later highlighted on by Christian's part of the story as well, so there's some nice symmetry going on. Not fully trusting Amos because Jim is a rational, normal person. He gives extra assurance to the spy that he won't be harmed, that anything that Amos inflicts upon him, he'll receive as a punishment. So he already demonstrates a clear sign of restraint and empathy that I feel like season 1 takes extra care to show that there is a lacking of within the setting at large. Getting back to the larger plot, though, the actual communications malfunction that occurred was basically just the spy sending a data packet to Christian, because he's Christian's spy. However, the unusualness of the transfer itself is what caught MCR's attention. So ultimately, the hot water they find themselves in is because of the spy, which even further highlights Jim's restraint as to not immediately reprimand him or just straight up kill the guy. But getting back to the main plot, this basically causes the MCR to come crashing down on them. One of the patrol ships is basically on a beeline to them, demanding manifests, passports, bill of ladings, all that stuff, to verify that they are who they are and they need to be in MCR space. This basically results in the crew going on a wild goose chase for a possible secret code book. As it turns out, we found out in the interrogation episode, one of Jim's crewmates is actually previous MCR military. I didn't find it pertinent to cover it in that specific episode because I know it'd come back later and I'm trying to trim bloat, but, along with the spy knowing the tricks of the trade for espionage, as well as the crew members' previous experience in the MCR, they're able to deduce that there is likely some kind of code book that special ops wet work types use to get like a free pass throughout the sector. In the end, they are able to ascertain the whereabouts of the code book, give them the proper password, and they get off scot-free, but they're cutting it real close. The drama's at an all-time high, the character development's at an all-time high. Great episode so far. And that about covers it for Jim's part of the episode. So since we mentioned Christian already, I figure we could just move on to her. The episode does a really good job about carrying the momentum from finding out about her previous tragic backstory into this next episode. After having received the data transfer from her spy on the Rocinante, Christian's kind of left at a dead end, or at her own wit's end, about what to do with the situation. And this is where we get more insight into how ruthless she is as a character, and how she's willing to bend rules and exercise her privilege and power that she has as a civil servant. Having been a mother, even though she no longer is, or maybe you could argue that once a mom, always a mom, she does something really human and understandable, I guess. She basically tracks down Jim's mom. I don't know if there's some kind of precedent for it, or if she just skirted the rules and bent some corners and broke some wrists along the way, but yeah, she ends up finding Jim's mom. So with a Black Ops hovercraft as her ride and her entourage in the backseat for protection, she beelines it towards the estate. Upon arriving at the property, Christian basically waves all her protection away in exchange for a more humanitarian, person-to-person, mother-to-mother kind of an exchange. Watching the scene unfold, you're not really sure what Christian's initial plan even is. It really comes off as like a desperate scramble for any kind of relevant information at all. But not in a sense of like actionable intel, she's just trying to get a bead on what kind of a person Jim even is. Eventually, this all culminates in Christian feeling that Jim isn't in anybody's pocket. He's just a guy in a bad situation. Having cleared the air with someone that she can more personally relate to and having an emboldened sense of assuredness, she basically goes back to her boss, Aaron Wright, to clear some things up. After some oral fencing and some slip-ups on Aaron Wright's part, he eventually owns up to the fact that he tried to silence Jim. All those stealth ships attacking the Donager were basically under his orders specifically, further emphasizing that there's some kind of shadow government within the government and that he's definitely a part of it. He's a sussy boy. And that completes the coverage for Christian's part of the episode. Really great storytelling. Fantastic interpersonal payoff. Well done. Christian finally feels like a real character. And that takes us to Joe. Joe's a bit of a sidecar Andy right now. The only major things we really get from Joe this episode are a correspondence with one of his old cop buddies that ended up getting relieved from duty, and another lead where the Anubis may be. The same ship that Jim and Co. are looking for in MCR Spacer right now. It's all coming together. But that about wraps up Windmills. That takes us on to episode 8, Salvage. Oh boy, guys, this one's a bit of a doozy and a little complicated to cover retrospectively, so just bear with me. For simplicity's sake, we're just going to get rid of Christian right off the jump because she has arguably the least impact in it. So we pick up this episode right where we left her last episode. She's talking to Aaron Wright, and he's more or less taunting her at this point. While Christian's trying to argue the validity of him being a political asset and, oh, you can't do this because of the OPA, Aaron Wright basically stops her in her tracks and is like, oh, well, you remember your dead friend that you got killed because of this? It would be a shame if that happened to you. With more subtext and done subtly. And that's it for Christian, like for real. She's not really in this episode a lot. Which really sucks on the one hand because she's just starting to get good. She's starting to become a compelling character, but I get it. There's like real plot happening elsewhere. So we'll move on to Jim because he's the big plot driver right now, and then Joe comes in to tie it all up. So on to Jim. After successfully skirting the ops in MCR space, Jim and crew are successful in finding the Anubis, the stealth fighter ship hidden inside of one of the dwarf planet meteorites in the belt. And it's the same fucked up scene that the Canterbury was. All the bay doors are open, all the airlocks are open, there's no real sign of a struggle, so on and so forth. But that's not really the big issue here. The Anubis is actually plagued with protocules, not some minute amount on the drive engine or anything like that. I mean, if you think about the ship's hull as the skeleton, it's really infested with all the musculature and the tendons and the soft tissue as the protocules. So clearly, whatever struggle happened over the protocules, it got way out of hand way quick. So having explored all of the Anubis and having nothing of any substantive value, Jim and crew take one of the shuttles on the Anubis and fly straight to Arrow Station, the same station that Joe is heading to where the Anubis was last docked at. Shortly after docking, Jim and crew basically leverage the spy into utilizing his OPA contacts to help identify where Julie may be. Trying to stay as low-key as possible, they end up tracking her down to a motel. Unfortunately, Aaron Wright seems to be completely hell-bent on silencing Jim, so the hotel is already booby-trapped with a team of assassins. Just a group of hired mercenaries on retainer there waiting for Jim to show up, or someone to show up to investigate for Julie. Unsurprisingly, this ends up with a violent confrontation by the assassin mercenaries trying to take Jim's life. And they would have succeeded. They had them pinned, they had the fire superiority, it was up for Jim and crew. Even with Amos's rabid tenacity and, it seems like, conditioned non-fear of death. The only way they actually got out of this was by Joe, just by miracle of happenstance, arriving at the exact same time as them and joining the fight in the midst of the chaos. And of course, Jim's not gonna know who the fuck this guy is. Like, who's this washed up a loser coming to save us? So the typical action movie things happens where Amos and Joe have this weird sizing up moment and Jim's trying to be diplomatic, like, hey, who are you? What do you want? And Joe's not having none of this bullshit. He's just finally found Julie, arguably the one person he's ever cared about, and he's on a mission to get to her. With Jim and co. effectively being in tow behind Joe, say that 5 times fast, they make their way up to Julie's room, and man, is it just, it's peak cinema. Everything that's been built up for, all of it converging in one singular moment of reveal. Julie's there alright, but she's all fucked up from the protocule. As far as we can ascertain, all of the implication of the protocule being a bioweapon from Joe's part of the story is basically confirmed in this moment. All we see after all this time with Joe, Jim, and trying to get to the bottom of this is Julie in the bathtub, curled up, and just fucking sprouting stuff. If you've ever seen HBO's The Last of Us, or if you're familiar with any kind of like horror media where there's some kind of parasitic host relationship, she's just fucking sprawling with tendrils and flowers and all kinds of gross shit. Naturally, Joe is devastated, but they can't hang out for long, and this is kind of the bonding moment between Joe and Jim. For all they know, an entire station's worth of hired agents are on their way to get them. So Jim has to be the voice of reason here for Joe and say, hey, I don't know what your guys' relationship is, but you're really beat up over this, but I would rather be beat up than be dead. And basically has to drag him away from the body, and boom, yin and yang, antagonist, protagonist, lead, Lancer relationship established. It all meshes together so perfectly. Joe, the more relativist, loner, intellect, ooh, I'm Batman type, and Jim, the pluralist, absolutist, I am considering myself morally righteous type. It's perfect. So as they make their getaway, that's just where this episode ends. It just cuts to them like cutting and running. It's so fucking good. But yeah, that's where episode 8 ends, and we move on to episodes 9 and 10, which are kind of done as like a part 1, part 2 finale type deal, so we'll cover those together. Okay, and in similar fashion to the previous episode we covered, we're just going to get Christian out of the way. Not because she's an uninteresting character or what she's got going on in the plot right now is uninteresting, just because there's not as much of it compared to the other two characters. After formally, officially hearing about DeGraff's suicide from Aaron Wright, Christian takes it upon herself to go investigate his property and his house and all of his data files to see if there's anything damning about this. Well, it turns out that whoever murdered him didn't properly wipe all the drives or something like that. Basically, this leads to the discovery by Christian that the thing that got him killed was him investigating stealth ship manufacturing on Mars and in the belt at large. The only kicker is that there is nothing unusual on Mars or in the belt, which could only mean that Earth itself is implicated in the manufacturing and distribution of stealth ships to the OPA. Realistically, in my own opinion, the only way that would be possible is if there was some kind of shadow government doing some shady shit in the back end with Raytheon. That's just a joke. I don't know if Raytheon exists in 300 years, but probably. In essence, this basically boils down to Christian realizing there's a larger plot at play that she doesn't know about, and that Aaron Wright is the number one suspect given his demeanor and basically the fact that he's so sus. Sorry, I just can't not meme on the guy. He's just, he's like, if you've seen Naruto, he's like Orochimaru, dude. Like, for you not to know that there's something going on with them, like, I get it. There's in-universe, like in-setting reasons, but it's just so funny to me. And that basically covers all Christian's plot relevance for like the rest of season 1. Unfortunately, that's all we get, but it's like I said in the beginning, Christian has really been set up, paced, and propositioned in a way that she's going to be a big player next season. Okay, now on to the big bombastic action of the finale. The last 2 episodes are basically just Joe and Jim trying to get back onto the Rocinante after the whole station starts going haywire. It's in the last 2 episodes that it is revealed that the protocule is some kind of biological weapon. As a matter of fact, one of the scientists who are working on Julie's weird crystallized dead body doesn't even technically refer to it as a biological weapon in the traditional sense. It's like some new age quantum smart particle bullshit. The important thing to note about it is that it is not airborne contagious. It is only pathologically contagious. So like you would have to get their sweat or their spit or their blood or something directly introduced into your body. Getting back to the main plot, the reason Jim, Joe, and crew have to get off the station is that it's basically going to be used as a testing ground / experimentation for the use case of the protocule. How they plan to actually carry this out is basically just false flag everybody. The station administration or the local government, however you want to put it, basically say that the station has gotten blasted blasted by radiation or something like that, and that they're going to go around giving people shots to offset the effects of that. You know, you can draw real-world parallels to this with like the Tuskegee experiments and maybe what some nutters will say about the COVID vaccine and shit like that. But you know, the books were written during the 2010s, and then this got adapted. Season 1 released in 2016, I think. So yeah, it's interesting. Like, the concept's always been there, don't get me wrong, but there's plenty of parallels you could draw from this. But I just thought that I would be remiss if I didn't bring it up. So there you go. So yeah, while evading the hired mercenaries on the station and basically catching up each other on what was happening with their individual plot lines and how they've reconnected, it's very interesting to see the characters interact. Like I said before, there's clear delineation in the character archetype where it's like Jim is he's not doughy-eyed or naive or anything, but the reason I bring this up is because there's one part of the show where Jim basically says, yeah, I hope I don't have to use this. I've never used this before. Even though we know he was in the military, like, for you to be in the military at any capacity, you can't be the conscientious objector type. Like, you have to be ready to get down when the down is getting. So to see that clear contrast between his attitude towards violence and then Joe's almost disgusted look that he gives him, like, you're going to put yourself in this position, but then expect not to be put in the position you're putting yourself in. It's really great. It's almost like the stark contrast at large with the UN enjoying their pluralistic, liberal democracy, and then the rest of the solar system, you know, the MCR, namely, having to exist in this real, harsh, like, big R, capital R, real space. It's like, you know, it's really great. Unfortunately for Jim, this is basically the only way they're going to get off the station, though, is if they violently seize the means of doing so. So the last 2 episodes basically consist of Joe and Jim getting into small skirmishes with patrolling mercenaries. While roaming the station and trying to avoid contact with any kind of mercenaries, they do end up stumbling into one of the, I guess you could call them, breeding rooms for the protocule that the mercenaries and science team have developed. It's basically just a room that blasts you with radiation. And the reason for that is because basically the protocule only really grows from raw energy. Unlike most organisms, use ATP or some kind of biochemical energy transfer form. Nah, the protocule is just built different, and they just feed off of raw energy. So like any kind of radiation, electricity, things like that. During the discovery of the breeding room, both people, Joe and Jim, get blasted by radiation in a, quote, lethal dose level, according to Jim. Now, I'm going to be real with you guys. I try to stay as close to blind with the media I engage with as possible, but I really don't think they'd kill off their 2 main protagonists, especially after they finally linked up like this. Who knows? Maybe I'm wrong and they're going to pull a Ned Stark, but I think they're going to go the route that they're going to MacGuffin their way out of this with some future space magic healing bullshit, which to me makes me feel a little bit cheated as the audience, but I don't know. I mean, the stakes seem high enough already, guys. Like, you don't need to infuse it artificially with like, oh no, our characters got hit with radiation even though they live in space. Real quick, another key thing I want to mention for Jim is his reconciliation with Christian Spy. During the 2-part finale, the spy somehow catches wind or puts together what's happening and essentially is begging Jim whenever he's alone to take him with him. And this is when we see Jim truly start to evolve and develop as a character, and how he has to reconcile with the fact that sometimes you can't just make things work. Sometimes you need to resort to violence, or at least condemn people to death. So the spy's begging Jim, like, hey, let me follow you. I can't go back down that way in the station. If I go that way, you're basically telling me to kick rocks and die. And Jim, to his credit, he doesn't kill him. He doesn't use violence directly to stop him from joining him. He needs only to allude to violence by shooting a couple warning shots, but he basically doesn't allow himself to become victim of some kind of gaslighting or mind trickery or genjutsu or whatever you want to call it. Don't be fooled though, he does effectively kill this man, and we do see him die on screen later, and we're going to talk about it, because that shit is crazy. Eventually, Jim and Joe do reunite with crew back on the Rocinante for, just to preserve the thrill of the finale. I'm not going to get into like play-by-plays about what happens, but everyone eventually does reunite on the Rocinante after everyone undergoes their own struggles. So the finale ends proper with the good widescreen shot of Jim and crew pulling out on the Rocinante and then shooting off into the distance. Our heroes make it out alive, they live to see another day, and uncover even more truths about how twisted the world is. For the spy, though, it's not a good time. It's at the very last moments of the season that we get a true glimpse into the nature of what the protocule even is. So just to start off, we'll give the context of what happens, and then we could speculate about it after the fact. We see the spy kind of meandering towards this light, whether he's going there because it's what he wants to do, or if there's some weird kind of inception suggestion kind of thing going on, we don't really know. But he's going towards this light, and then once he rounds the corner, once he looks up, or he gets a better look at what's producing the light, we see just this horrible eldritch parody of a person kind of a thing. I don't mean to be graphic or anything, but it looks like a bunch of aborted babies mashed together with like a mass grave, and it's just writhing and fluctuating, and it doesn't have any real like definition, so to speak. Like if the actual physical representation was its soul, it's just fucking moving around and malleable and not really even defined. And that's season 1, baby. Give yourself a hand, give yourself a pat on the back, take a shot, do whatever you gotta do, but look at you, you fucking made it, baby. Nearly 2 hours, but we covered like 20 hours of television or something. It's only 10, what is wrong with me? So yeah, now we can get into the major overarching review. With all the context we have, with all the coverage we've done, I think it's a fair time to really dive into what truly interests me, and we could talk about it holistically. Obviously, first and foremost, the Protocule. Fantastic name, just killer name right off the jump. I've never seen anything depicted this way in fictional media ever. And I mean, I watch anime, I read comics, I read manga, and this is by far some of the weirdest shit I've seen tried to be portrayed in a live action format. Even just appearances aside, we have so much to talk about in regards to like, does it have an identity? Is it conscious? If it's not conscious, will it eventually become conscious after it hits a critical mass of like absorbing people? What exactly is the scientific method employed to create it? Is it really like smart particle engineering? Is it something else entirely? Who knows? I suspect that the Protocule is going to play a huge role in the story going forward. Kind of similar to like Reaper technology or like Prothean precursor technology did in Mass Effect, where it's like, oh, that's a cute little world setting dressing, and then it turned out to be something way bigger. I just want to take a second to sing the praises of the pacing as well. I think more often than not, pacing and how you deliver certain world-building elements really affects the story. And The Expanse has just done that with flying colors. It chose a lane, it decided to give you something pretty to look at whenever something wasn't really moving the plot forward, and it was just done so well. Just a real quick example of that is like how Christian is one of the main protagonists, like one of the 3 main leads, and we follow her and how she navigates and explores it, and getting to see it from an experienced, seasoned angle like that, rather than some shows where they'll often pick a character where they don't really know or they're out of their element so that the audience can discover it with them. It's just really refreshing whenever the show just trusts the audience to get it. And we talk so much about the setting, let me just break down why I like the setting so much. It's familiar enough in that you can relate immediately to the society and probably the daily struggles of its average citizen because it's just an extension or a theorized projection of what our society will be if we just continue down the path. And that's something reflected even in the opening credits for the show too. It's similar to like Game of Thrones or Dark Matter, which I will be covering at some point. Most major TV shows nowadays have some kind of opening cinematic credit sequence, and The Expanse shows the world developing, facing crisis, nearly collapsing, almost dying, all the way up to the robust space age that they enjoy today. Okay, that's all I wanted to really gush about. So we'll take this all the way to the final score then. I'm not a huge fan of giving things scores out of 10. I think it's kind of a flawed way to do things, and unless you're really connected to the critic and their preferences and dislikes, I think it's kind of a disingenuous way to do things. But I will give The Expanse Season 1 at least an 8.5 out of 10. I really want to give it a 9, but I feel like I've seen too much sci-fi that I was able to nitpick a couple of tropes and plot devices that I didn't really care for too much, but didn't subtract so much away from the main concept that it became a problem for me. 8.5 out of 10. If you enjoy sci-fi, you'll have a good time watching The Expanse. Well, you guys, we did it. If you're still here after this 2-hour-long ride, I can only say thank you so much for giving me the time of day. I know there's plenty of stuff you could be listening to, you could be doing to fill your time, and I'm just glad you spent it with me. If you have any questions on how to reach me, you can follow me on X at Effective Media. The username should be The Effective Media Show. If you want to support the show, just give me a follow on Spotify. You can also find me on my YouTube channel, The Effective Media Show. And you guys stay safe out there, and hopefully I see you soon.